Hi, everybody. This is the brightest screen I've ever stood in front of, and my voice is equally bright. So congratulations on having such an amazing space for speakers. You know, often the tech is not anything like this, so this is great. So I'm talking today about Towards a Walkable Mansfield, and I have the best job in the world, which is I get to go to places. Now, I also do projects which last months, years, decades, but I spend maybe half my time going to places, giving lectures, and leaving. And it's an amazing job because I get to say what I think. People actually want me to say what I think, and sometimes not everyone likes that, but then I get to go. So I can say what I think, and I've been told tonight that I should say everything that I think. And I want you to know that you've got a lot of great things going here. It's obviously a well-off community. Your schools are great. You've got great places to live. And, but it's my job to criticize or I'm not helping. So I am going to you know, not pull any punches. Let's start. I've been giving these talks now for about 30 years, and a number of years back I changed it to Towards a More Walkable. Most of the places I go are Towards a More Walkable Dallas, Towards a More Walkable Birmingham, whatever. For tonight I made it walkable, because as many of you have told me, this is not a walkable community. You have one really great walkable place that could be a lot better, but this really great bones right here for the Main Street and downtown to be walkable. And as I'm going to show you, probably a lot of you are aware, there's a bunch of projects on the boards that are high quality that will be walkable once they're complete. But you're not there yet. You're principally a driving community. As evidence of that, this was my wheels while I was here. It's the first time I've ever been given a Suburban to drive around. This thing has like a jet engine. It's so powerful. I was terrorizing your community. I hope it doesn't end up in the newspapers. But I thought, you know, this is it. Mansfield, Texas, Suburban. And that's what you are. And when I talk about urban, because I'm going to contrast the suburban with the urban, when I talk about urban, I don't mean big city, smog, and, you know, and all the things that people associate with that word. What I mean is essentially walkable. And so I'm going to use the word urban. I just want, don't bristle when I say it. An urban place, as we support in the Congress for New Urbanism, is basically a walkable place. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what that means. But you have so many nice things going for you, and we're going to get into that. In my book, The Walkable City, I spend about a third of it talking about why it's so important to be walkable, why we need it. And most of the book is about how to do it. I'm not going to give the why we need it talk tonight because actually most places that call me in, they kind of already get that. Right? They know they want to be more walkable. If I need to give that talk, call me back and I can do that. Or you can just go to TED. And it's this. I have a couple TED Talks up on the website. This is the one that's the why. It has no pictures, and it's all about really the three groups who I discovered about 15 years ago were arguing for the same stuff that we planners were arguing for, but much more effectively. The economists, the environmentalists, and the epidemiologists. And the economists showing us how walkable places are much more productive economically. And of course, talking about the great costs associated with tying yourself to the automotive lifestyle. And I learned last week at the Congress for New Urbanism that in a typical city, 70% of the population actually can't afford to own a car. I mean, they do, but by the federal government's guidelines about what you're supposed to spend on transportation, 20% of your income, and the typical car costing $10,000 to $15,000 a year to drive, the majority of people in most cities actually can't afford to drive cars. The environmentalist story, I don't have to get into. You all understand the principal contribution we all make to climate change individually is our driving, with very few exceptions. And then, of course, the epidemiological conversation about what it means, and I have a slide that illustrates that, what it means to kind of engineer out of existence in your community the useful walk, which used to give us exercise every day. We didn't need to go to the gym because we were actually moving around, and of course now we have to go to the gym. So that's all in this talk, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how to do it and how to do it here in Mansfield. So the book has what's called the general theory of walkability. And the general theory of walkability asks the question, particularly in America, in which driving is so cheap and so easy, it's heavily subsidized, the car is there in the driveway between you and everything, right? It's so easy to fall into it. There's all these economic incentives to drive. If you own a typical sedan, 4/5 of your costs are fixed costs of basically owning the car, and 1/5 the costs are variable costs. So that means once you're sunk into it, the more you use it, the smarter you are, and it makes sense to use it as much as you can. So given that, that framework, that structure, how do you get people to make the choice to walk, particularly people who own cars? Because they tend to be, right, a lot of people don't own cars, a lot of people don't drive. About 30% of us don't drive. We're too old, too young, too infirm, too poor, some reason. But for those of us who do drive, they tend to be making the decisions in our communities, and so we want people to want to make the choice to walk. And the answer is the walk has to be as good as the drive, and to be as good as the drive, it has to do 4 things simultaneously. There's a bunch of you who've handed me books to sign. I apologize, you've heard all this before, but for the rest of you, I'll go through it. The walk has to be useful, the walk has to be safe, the walk has to be comfortable, and the walk has to be interesting. So that's the structure of most of my books. Lectures, it's the organization of the talk I'm going to give you today. And here's where I pause to say, this is not a standard talk. The standard talk I give is just one day. I spend some time in the Google, cutting pictures from Google and Google Earth. I show up at lunch, I take a tour, I present, and then I leave. This is actually a different scope of work which the city has asked for from me that I call a mini walkability study. I do full-fledged walkability studies that are big jobs with designs for every street in the community and a lot of product, but this is kind of the smallest scope I offer that's an actual scope, which is that I've spent 3 days here and I've really looked hard not only at your existing conditions, but the proposals that are on the boards in the town. And so rather than giving my tip, the reason I'm telling you this is it'll be slightly longer than the 45 minutes or 50 minutes. I hope that I don't go too long. I think we've scheduled as much as an hour and a half. I don't think I'll take that long, but I do plan to entertain you, so don't get bored. It's my job to keep you from being bored. So, let's talk about the useful walk. And apologies to Bill Giedema, who knows these folks all too well. These are my mentors, Andres Duani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. Andres used to give this talk. These are really the parents of the new urbanist movement. I worked with them for 10 years. Andres used to give this talk called The Story of Planning, in which he discussed how back in the 19th century, the people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners actually said, hey, let's move the housing away from the factories. And they did that, and lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes, and we like to say they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So you have the onset of single-use zoning, large areas of the landscape dedicated to just one use. This is called Euclidean zoning in the US, and we now know this is wrong. You won't learn this in planning school anymore, but it dominated the profession for half a century, and it just so happens that most places I go to work on a piece of land, there's already a plan on that land, and it looks just like this, right? You have to actively remove these plans from most properties. Now, when the uses are standalone and they're single use, of course, walking is not useful because you can't get to anything different during your day. So actually, I was an art history major, and they say that wasn't the best choice economically, but I can say you don't want to, when you're planning a city, you don't want a Rothko. He was the blob guy, right? You don't want a Rothko, you want a Syrah. And Syrah was the pointillist. This is not a land zoning map. This is a a land use map. It's the actual land uses in Manhattan. You can see that it's like confetti. It's extremely fine-grained, which is why Manhattan is so walkable. And actually, this red color is vertically mixed use. So the more mixed use, the more useful walking is, the more walkable the place is, pretty straightforward. And that gets into the fundamental new urbanist conversation. That Andres gave this talk called Towns versus Sprawl. It became this book, Suburban Nation. I heard the talk in 1988. I slapped my forehead and said, this is what I want to work on for my career, because it was the best story I'd ever heard. It made me realize, I knew there were certain places I loved and certain places I hated. I didn't really know why until I heard the talk, and I also didn't know that it was actually illegal in the US to make more of the great places that we loved. And that's the message of this book, but the fundamental new urbanist talk that Andres gave probably for 20 years and finally got sick of and wouldn't give anymore, and I still give because I think it's so important, is to explain that there are only two ways to make a city. Actually, there's a million ways to make a city, but there's only two tested ways, tested by the thousands, of how to make a community. One is the traditional town. This is Newburyport, Massachusetts, near where I live. And the other is suburban sprawl. And these are the only two models we've really kicked the tires of, right? Suburban sprawl was an invention after World War II, principally. Traditional town was not invented. And it's important when folks are trying to reinvent the city, like the Neom folks out in Saudi Arabia, like, oh, we're going to invent a new, amazing, better kind of city. Well, cities weren't invented. Cities evolved naturally alongside man over 10,000 years, or more, actually, before they became non-nomadic. And there's an incredible wisdom that we can't fully understand. Chuck Marohn calls it spooky wisdom that cities have, that just makes them work so well with us humans. The principal difference between these two models is neighborhood form versus a non-neighborhood form. And a neighborhood in planning terms is defined as being compact, diverse, and walkable. Compact, you're looking at several neighborhoods of Newburyport here, but typically they're about a 5-minute walk from edge to center, which is the distance you walk without even thinking about it. You see big houses, smaller houses, places to work. The main street is over here, places to worship, places to recreate. Most of your daily needs are within walking distance. Not all of them, not the hospital, not the university, typically, but most of your daily needs are close at hand. And then, of course, there's lots of streets, and they all connect, so none of them need to be all that big, which is the principal thing that makes it walkable. Sprawl, in contrast, clearly not compact. The name is sprawl. Clearly not diverse. Only one use can cover huge areas, as I showed you in that map. You're looking at almost entirely housing in this square mile. And then, this is interesting, there's lots of streets, but most of them don't go anywhere. Most of them are loops or cul-de-sacs. So the few streets that do connect, and you know this with the traffic you have here, there's very few streets that are actually connective, so they very quickly get overburdened with traffic. And look at these collectors and arterials. You'll notice there's not a single address on these streets, right? So they're kind of wasted economically as well. Their only purpose, their sole purpose, is to move as much stuff, the stuff being cars and trucks, as quickly as possible. So we call them traffic sewers, because that's how they're sized, that's how they're designed. And so it's not walkable. I learned on Adam Ruins Everything that if you live here, well, I should say, if you live here, you're 270% more likely to be killed in traffic than if you live here. So even though there's all these cul-de-sacs and loops, the minute you leave your loop or your cul-de-sac, you are, of course, tremendously vulnerable in the high-speed environment. So you have collector roads here as well. I did a lot of touring and saw those. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts because each one is so pure. The places where you only live, the places where you only work, the places where you only shop. Schools get bigger and bigger, which means they get further and further away, right? Playing fields are consolidated and supersized. And it's wonderful that, we've got 8 baseball diamonds here and 8 soccer fields. The kid who lives here actually has a 2-mile drive to get there. Oops, looks like you've got this too. But when you presume that everyone's going to drive everywhere, then it's actually a natural decision to do things like this, right? It fits perfectly. So yeah, so the 2-mile drive is like this to get from the house to the field. And sometimes things are very close to each other, but they're still not. I think I saw like a little, squirrel path through from the cul-de-sac to the raccoon rut from the cul-de-sac to the shopping. But when the presumption is that every trip is by car, then decisions like this, even adjacency, can mean having great separation. So this is of course LA, when you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, which was created for travel and for commerce, it effectively becomes a commuting system. And I always tell people, for many people, this is still the American dream. The house with nothing but other houses around it. Depending on when you poll, it's between 40 and 60%, phones off please, that's me. Between 40 and 60% of people don't want anything else but houses around their house. After COVID, it was about 60, most of the time it's closer to 40. But I always tell people it's a two-part deal. You can have this, but just understand that that comes with that. Often to absurd extremes. And the amount that we invest in our horizontal infrastructure and rob from schools and churches and public buildings so that you never have to wait more than one cycle at a light. It's preposterous, right? But if you have to wait more than one cycle at a light in this incredibly banal, soul-crushing environment, you just want to kill yourself. So, of course, we don't let that happen. And Walter Kulash took this picture 25 years ago. It's not Photoshop. The longer your commute, the more likely you are to be divorced. That's a fact. The less likely you are to participate in social activities in your community. And this is the epidemiologist slide that I warned you about. I got this from Howie Frumkin 20-something years ago. And he would say, the fact that it's natural to drive, to park, to take the escalator, to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is why we have the first generation of Americans. Now it's the second, because this was 20 years ago. We have the second generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents, because we've engineered out of existence the useful walk in our communities. Driving can be a real drag. Walking can be worse. But this is the key diagram. And we've doctored it a bit over the years, made it a little bit more accurate. But if you remember nothing else from my talk today, just sear this into your eyeballs, which is that these are the two models side by side. And it's just important to recognize it's the same stuff. Places to live, places to work, places to recreate, places to shop. But how big is it? And of course, this exaggerates the closeness, just so we could get it into one slide. Right? This exaggerates the closeness of these things that are typically further apart. How big are they? How far apart are they? Or is it your Syrah? And do you have a street network, a porous network of small blocks, or do you have what's called a dendritic system, a branching system, where the typical trip goes from the driveway to the local, to the collector, to the arterial, to the highway, and then marches back down again, and there's actually only one path from anything to anything else. The great irony is, this was created for walking, this was created for cars. This works better for cars. Because, God help you, if there's one engine fire on the collector road, your whole city shuts down for an afternoon. There's 21 ways to get from here to there. So actually the model is and it's much more robust. Sprawl almost never grows up, right? It really can't, because it's locked in that dendritic road system. A village can become a town, can become a city in this porous, flexible grid that allows for that sort of molting to take place. So when you look, right, we're going to talk about making new places. Most of the talks I give actually are focused almost entirely on existing downtowns. You have a lot happening here, though, so I'll be talking about both. So we'll get back to this towards the end. But this is all about making new communities, which we still do. But when you're talking about existing communities now, we're in this first category. What's it called? What's the first category? The useful walk. I'm testing the students in the room. The first category is the useful walk. So you're asking yourself, how do you make a place more useful? If it's an existing downtown, you ask the question, what uses are missing or underrepresented? And in most American downtowns, the answer is housing. Particularly in our bigger cities, we have CBDs, right, Central Business District, and there was a lot of white flight and other factors that led for people to flee the city. But generally speaking, compared to Canada and other places, we have the least housing in our downtowns. And the downtowns are actually the place where mixed use, if walking depends on mixed use, then the downtowns have the greatest potential because they're the place that mixed use is possible. Because you can bring a ton of housing into a downtown and you generally don't upset people. You know, try to bring one 7-Eleven into a cul-de-sac and see what happens, right? So you have a smattering of housing, very little. You have a ton of things that people would love to live near. Certain people, maybe about 40% of you, maybe 50%. And you have that opportunity then for that mixed-use walkable lifestyle in the city center. Jane Jacobs famously said, you can't rely on bringing people downtown, you have to put them there. And she meant housing. And she was talking about Wall Street in the 1950s, or the late 50s. And she said, 400,000 people come to Wall Street every day to work. Why is there not one great restaurant on Wall Street? Why is there not one great gym on Wall Street? And the answer is what she called time spread. That a great restaurant or a great gym needs a nighttime crowd as well as a lunchtime crowd. And so if you really want your city to sing, then you really need the residents in the downtown, whether it's a large city or a small city. And a lot of cities like Des Moines, where I've worked, are actively subsidizing the creation of more housing in their downtown cores. So in Des Moines, they had a 10-year tax abatement for example, turning this old office building into housing. 10 years of tax increment financing on top of that, 20 years of help. They went from, they basically quadrupled the amount of housing in their downtown. And they realized that, yeah, there's a cost to that, but it accrues back to the city in the form of just more energy, more being a place where people want to be. And then, I've never been here, but folks in your planning department talked to me about Woodstock, Georgia. Has anyone here been to Woodstock, Georgia? So I didn't know it, but I looked it up as a good model. And what you see here is a traditional kind of whistle-stop town outside of Atlanta that I'm sure the train isn't doing very much these days. But developers got involved and took a pretty low, you know, look at this, it looks kind of like your Main Street, and dropped some pretty big apartment buildings in there, which gave that kind of spatial definition to the edge of the street, brought the bodies down, and made it a place where people want to be. I think that's a good model to look at. So this took 1 minute. I've also condemned some buildings. But I was just looking for opportunities to put hundreds and hundreds. This is probably 1,000 units of housing. And I don't want to dwell on this image and tell you what's what because it's probably just wrong. But there's opportunities, both empty lots and underutilized lots. By the way, the first thing you do is take out the architect's office. I did that there. But there's these opportunities right in the heart of your downtown core. You know, if you could snap your fingers and have these 1,000 units in your downtown, it would be a different downtown. And actually, you know, this justifies and ultimately would pay for the investment in a new streetscape that would attract the people to come to these places. So that was the first category, the reason to walk, the useful walk. The second, I won't quiz you. The second category is the safe, feel free to shout it out. Second category is the safe walk. The safe walk is where I spend most of my time. Please come in. Why do I spend most of my time on the safe walk? Because the useful walk, the comfortable walk, and the interesting walk are principally a function of the buildings that line the streets. What are their uses? Are they making well-shaped spaces? That's comfortable. And are they interesting? Right, that's the interesting walk. But the safe walk is a function of the streets themselves. We used to do 20-year plans. When I started, we were doing Vision 2020. That went by. But more and more these days, we still do 20-year plans, but more and more these days, when I come to a city, they want change before the next election, right? They want change within 2 years, 3 years. And the question is, how can we as a city make that change? And the answer lies in your streets. Very often it lies in simply restriping streets rather than rebuilding streets. because that can change traffic patterns and safety very quickly. But more and more of my projects are simply street design. Excuse me. So, in America, I just collect these slides of all the things that people do with their cars. Cars trying to make new cars, you know, you name it. And thanks to Twitter and the internet, the drive-through pharmacy, you know, hey, what's on television, you know, Collision, Lone Star, Texas Collision. Anyway, I just collect these. I'm not sure how this one happened, but and oh, so close. But it's fun to joke about, but of course there's like a more than a 1% chance that you will die in a car crash. And we've all lost loved ones or had loved ones seriously injured, permanently injured. Several million Americans are permanently injured every year in car crashes. It's not really a laughing matter, particularly for pedestrians. And the data on walking has been astounding, and it's updated now for 2021. I understand that with 2022, we're going to get to 100%, which is that it's twice as deadly to be a pedestrian in America as it was in 2009, I believe. Yeah, something like that. Why? There's a lot of factors. There's this wonderful book by Angie Schmidt called Right of Way that talks about the pedestrian and bicyclist injury and death epidemic in the US. She speaks to a number of factors. The second biggest factor, first of all, cell phones are not it. They've got cell phones in Europe, and pedestrian deaths have been plummeting. The first one is the suburbanization of poverty. You know, it used to be that the poor people lived in the city and the rich people lived in the suburbs. Now, poor people can't afford the city, and they're living in the suburbs without cars in an environment that was created strictly for driving. And I'm staying out at the Spring Hill Suites, and I've been trying not to drive, and just going across the street to I actually found the restaurant that was on my side of the street. But, you know, being in that environment and actually not having a car and being among the 30% of us who don't drive is extraordinarily dangerous. And there's often no crosswalk, right? Does anyone know what the biggest factor is? Street design is how we can fix it, and it is a factor, but it's not the biggest factor.
Size of cars?
Size of cars, yeah. So, you know, not to single out Texas, this happens everywhere, but the fact that more and more of us are driving SUVs and driving trucks with the higher hood, harder to stop, more momentum, more, you know, kinetic energy, and the fact that you get thrown under the car instead of on top of the hood. There's the sight lines. You've probably seen these studies where it takes 12 kids in front of your Escalade before you can see the 13th kid waving in front of your Escalade. There's not much I can do about that, or you can do about that. I did, though, when Angie Schmidt's book came out, I sold my SUV and I got a station wagon, because it would ruin my career if I killed someone with an SUV. So, and other reasons. It handles better, too. But you know, there's not too much we can do about this, but this is kind of the backdrop. This is the foundation upon which we try to make things better with street design. This is the key diagram. There's a geometric relationship between speed and injury and death. So a car going 35 miles an hour is about 8 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. And anything you can do to get drivers to be on the lower end of that spectrum, or just one mile an hour even, makes a big difference. So what are the factors that cause drivers to go more slowly versus more quickly? I'm always wary when a newspaper says, you know, Jeff Speck is trying to slow cars down. I like to rephrase that, right? Let's just get people to drive the speed limit, right? Let's set reasonable speed limits in those places. You know, 95% of the city, by the way, you can speed to your heart's content in the auto zone. But in those places where we want people to walk, where there's a chance of people walking, both the new developments coming along in your suburban cul-de-sacs, right, as well, which are too wide, as you'll see, you probably already know. But also in places like this, in the heart of your downtown, in those places where walkability is possible, is happening, could be happening, What are the factors that cause people to drive more slowly versus more quickly? So it's important to understand that are there any engineers in the room? I'm sorry. I'm not sorry you're engineers. I'm apologizing for what I'm about to say. And what I'm about to say, I've learned from engineers. But what happened was American road design grew up out of American highway design. So the first road designers in the US were highway designers first. All the manuals got written for highway design and then were then applied to road design. And all the things, unfortunately, all the things that make a highway safe make a neighborhood dangerous. Think about when you go on the highway and how you select your speed, right? If you're like me, you look for a speed limit, you wait till you see a speed limit sign before you really floor it, then you look for a speed limit sign, and then you set your cruise control for 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, or whatever margin you're comfortable with. In that environment, if you design it for a speed well above the speed limit with wider lanes, I think the key word is forgiveness, elbow room, right? Anything you do to reduce the likelihood you're going to hit somebody at that given speed makes it safer. So wider lanes, no opposing travel, one-way travel, fewer intersections, big swoopy curves as opposed to tighter curves, no parallel parking, of course, no trees, those are FHOs, fixed hazardous objects, right? So all these things on a highway make perfect sense. But in a community, how do you set your speed? You don't even look, typically, if you're like me, you don't even look for signs, you feel on the street, you feel safe going a certain speed. And that's a factor of not having that forgiveness in the street. It's a factor of narrower lanes, parallel parking, street trees, two-way travel, lots of intersections, all those things. So let's go through those. Let's go through those things. And the sign doesn't make a difference when you're in this sort of environment. So the first one is the number of lanes. This is clearly a highway, but let's talk about city streets. You don't need me to tell you, the more lanes there are, the more it feels like a highway, the faster you're likely to go, the further you have to cross, the longer it takes to cross the street. You have that condition here with the solid 5 lanes in your main, it's like I'm seeing double here, in your main street. So I was called into Oklahoma City by the mayor because Prevention Magazine named Oklahoma City the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. Which isn't true. I don't think they'd been to Norman, Oklahoma, for example. Or Lawton. Anyone been to Lawton, Oklahoma? Yeah, that's the worst. So he said, what are we going to do? And I said, let's do a walkability study. And he said, what's that? And I said, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. I've now done about 15 of them, full walkability studies, not minis. And we looked at the car counts. You can see these, right, in the downtown core. 5, 6, 7,000. Any engineer will tell you a typical 2-lane street without turn lanes can handle 10,000 cars per day. Right? All the traffic on that street, 10,000 cars per day. 2 lanes are ample in a nice network. So here are the streets in our study. These were all 4 to 6 lanes, and they were all designated to be rebuilt over time as 4 to 6 lanes. And look at the car counts on these streets. So this 6-laner, because they sweep the curbs at rush hour, the 6-laner was handling 2 lanes of traffic every day. We were lucky that Devon Energy was building this tower, generating $200 million in tax increment. And they asked, what should we spend this money on? And my report had just been complete. And they said, let's rebuild every city street, curb to curb, actually building face to building face, over this 40-block downtown area. And it took them about a decade, but they did it. My job was to design the curb to curbs. I was able to, by right-sizing the streets to the actual traffic, I was able to remove 30% of the driving lanes, double the amount of on-street parking, and create a bike network where there was no bike network. And of course, we were told by the engineers that it would be Carmageddon. It would be gridlock. And fortunately, the engineer that was running the job for the city, she was confident. And she said, I know this 10,000 rule. And we actually made a rule that if a street had fewer than 10,000 cars per day, it couldn't get turn lanes. And there was never any traffic problem. Even while they were rebuilding it, there were no traffic problems. So the typical street went from 4 lanes to 2 lanes. Here it is under construction. This 4-lane one-way became a 2-lane two-way with a train in it. This street became that street. And this is what you do when you have money to spend. Most places I say either restripe everything or pick 1 or 2 key locations where a rebuild makes sense. So looking at your downtown, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Looking at your downtown, right, in this picture, someday we might hope for a larger walkable downtown, but this is enough, actually. And in this picture really is what I would consider to be the bounds, ignoring the residential neighborhoods that can walk to it from the sides. This is really the bounds of the heart of downtown that really has the potential to be walkable, and pretty soon. And Jason will tell you my jaw dropped when I saw the numbers. This is north of Broad on Main Street. This is south of Broad on Main Street. This is Broad to the east, and this is Broad to the west. So if this was Oklahoma City, Broad to the west wouldn't even get a turn lane. These all need, technically they don't, because people would adjust their behavior, but we're not going to get into that. To maintain the current number of trips that they have on them comfortably without congestion, these streets really do need center turn lanes. But here's my favorite slide I've been waiting to show you guys. This is 21 different road diets all around the US. When these road diets were done, the roads all had 3 lanes. Now what I mean by 3 lanes is a 2-lane road that has a nice long left-hand turn lane at the intersections, but frankly you can run it down the whole block. Maybe you put something pretty in the median when there's no one turning at all. But these are 3-lane streets, or 2-lane with left turn lanes. Look at the traffic counts. By the way, after the diet, just as many cars as before the diet. So in fact, the throughput, what the engineers call the throughput, was not reduced. Look at these numbers. The lowest one is above 14,000. And of course, they reach above 20,000. And look at your numbers. So there's no reason why that can't be, don't let anyone tell you, there's no reason why Main Street can't be a 3-lane street instead of a 5-lane street. I'm not the first person to come here and say that, but there's your evidence. So that's the number of lanes. And we'll talk about Main Street more when I finish up. Next is the width of the lanes themselves. Andre Stwani used to show this slide, and he'd say, the typical street, the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to experience the curvature of the earth. And it's true. You can see someone was doing donuts even in this street. The standards have changed, and they used to be narrower, and now they're wider. So this is 1960s subdivision, this is 1980s subdivision, same height of airplanes, same size of house, but notice the skinny streets in the 60s and the big fat streets in the 80s, and that's happened pretty much everywhere. People drive faster in wider lanes. We don't need any more studies, but there are tons of studies that show that the wider the lane, the faster people go. And lane width is one of the greatest, most important determinations of whether people are going to be going the speed limit in your neighborhoods or not. Now, thank goodness for NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, who've made it clear in their manual that 10 feet, which used to be the standard, should be the standard again. Now, we're talking not about little residential streets, back roads. We're talking about the busiest New York City style streets in your community. There's a 10-foot standard, and it's ample. This is a 7-foot parking space, by the way, which is a foot shy of the standard, which is 8 feet. But you see, yeah, it's a little tight so people won't speed, but it's plenty of room to get by, particularly when you have that middle turn lane. You know, the one place you might need an 11-foot lane, because sometimes transit agencies, which you don't have to worry about, push for 11-foot lanes, is when you have a 2-lane road constricted by parallel parking. So you've literally only got 20-foot clear, then you probably want a couple extra feet. But if you've got more than 2 lanes, then 10 feet, there's never a reason to go above 10 feet. Or narrower in residential neighborhoods. And what's important to understand is that there's a whole hierarchy. There's actually 4 different speed types. There's 4 different street types. Can someone let this person in by the door? There's 4 different there's a typology of speed streets, speed flow, free flow, slow flow, and yield flow. And you want to pick the right one for your neighborhood. If it's a neighborhood of mostly single-family houses, then actually yield flow, where you have maybe 12 feet for traffic in two directions, is perfectly normal. Cities like Portland have made them a city program. You know, a 20-foot street with parking one side that handles two-way traffic. Generally, there's a gap in the parking. Someone's coming at you, you duck in. Many of us grew up on streets like this. It seems impossible, but of course they work perfectly in most American cities. Here's one we built in South Carolina, project by the developer Vince Graham called Ion. This is a two-way street. Our projects are full of these. And he speaks at conferences. He's a wonderful speaker. You should get him here. He quotes, he shows his nice narrow streets. He quotes this famous philosopher who said, "Broad is the road to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life." And it's true. It's actually true. Now, I think you're a community that for many years put response time as the greatest goal for the design. And something I haven't seen outside of Texas, which really puts the sack in cul-de-sac, is the expanded corner in your subdivisions. I'd actually never seen that before I got to Texas. But it's important to remember that prevention is worth a ton of, ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure. And that's often forgotten because emergency services personnel are judged by their response time. And they'll tell you that. So if I get there faster, I get a raise. And no one wants to be waiting there for the fire truck, and it's true. But it's important to weigh the prevention against the cure. And there's, in my book, Walkable City Rules, which a couple of you have, this is the more technical book. If you want a page turner or a book that's going to convince people of stuff, then Walkable City is the book. But if you're doing the work, this is the more technical book. One of the rules, Rule 51, is expand the fire chief's mandate, shift the focus from response time to public safety. And I've met a bunch of public officials, for example, in Portland, who tell me, no, we want fewer people. We want to have fewer ambulance calls. We don't want to have faster ambulances. We want to have fewer ambulance calls, which leads to this rule, rewrite the fire chief's mandate to optimize public safety, not response times. Because the response time demand, which they have in downtown Dallas, by the way, that a fire truck is not allowed. When you're designing a piece of downtown Dallas, the fire truck, of course, when it turns left, it's crossing the oncoming lane. But a fire truck is not allowed to swing left to turn right. And they're reaming out all their corners because of that unwillingness, right? So it's always a struggle to, and this talks about how a number of fire departments are just getting smaller vehicles, right? But that it's a hard conversation to have, but if you look statistically at what's killing people, it's the car crashes, it's not the response times. Anyway, so I'm going to be showing images that pertain from a number of the projects that are happening here. This is the Reserve, which is one of your many nice new urbanist proposals that are happening. Here are the design standards in the Reserve, and it's got a 24-foot driving lane. This should, tomorrow, please make it a 20-foot driving lane. This is the Parkway in the Reserve, 36 feet, well, if you want people going 50, these are actually 12-foot lane's a 70-mile-an-hour lane. If you want people going 50 and up, then please build this way. But if there are going to be people around, families, kids around, these should be 10-foot lanes. People will get hurt. Second, the Starland Ranch, beautiful architecture by LRK, a lot of skill being applied. These different colors apply to different road sections, and this is a yield street. This is a two-way street. There's a mistake. This car should be facing the other way. One of those people that parked on the wrong side of the street. But it's got a 14-foot shared lane. This is proper. It can be 12, 14's fine. So these guys are doing it right. But I also want to point out, no parallel parking within the first 100 feet of the entryway. Why? People are afraid of conflict. Guess what? That conflict is what slows people down. We want to have people parking as close to that street as possible. We want, this sounds crazy if you're an engineer, but just trust me. We want opportunities for conflict. It's that friction that creates safety. So that's my message there. However, here's the standard street. There aren't many of the streets in the plan. It's the dark blue, but this is a street that's expected to get more traffic on it, and it's devolved to the 24-foot driving lane. That should be at 20 feet, not 24 feet. Okay? Harvest Point, another plan, very large plan that's coming in, which I'll be talking more about later, has these drives. This is a big drive. You have to be careful. There's a lot of tricks here. Because this is angle parking, these lanes can be a little bit wider because the car has to back up. Now, a car may be traveling quickly in this lane as this car backs into this lane. So this is why this is an 11-foot lane and a 12-foot lane against 60-degree parking. But this is a good street section in this plan. And then here's a much more delicate neighborhood street with a median 10-foot driving lane next to 8 feet of parallel parking on each side. This is definitely the sweet spot. This is a street I designed with others in Carmel, Indiana, and it has the 10-foot driving lanes exactly and the 8-foot parking lanes, and no one goes more than 12 miles an hour on this street, and it's absolute heaven. So remember this and remember Peter Swift, because I heard he's the one who did these streets, and I've been working with him for 30 years, and he's one of the best. So anything he says, you should trust. Now, what's next? Parallel parking is an essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. There are other ways to protect a curb, but parallel parking is about the best way. This is Fort Lauderdale, happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. I did a walkability study. Before I did it, you couldn't park here during happy hour because this was the way out of town. So here's happy hour on the parked side of the street, and here's happy hour on the unparked side of the street. No one wants to stand, sit, walk, hang out on a street that isn't protected, a sidewalk that isn't protected, and parallel parking does a great job. Another part of that, of course, is the street trees, which are really important. They slow cars down, sometimes dramatically, but better to hit a tree than a pedestrian. And those few studies that have been done make it clear that actually there are fewer car crashes, fewer driver injuries on streets that have trees versus those that don't, including on stretches of the same street. Where the trees appear and the trees disappear, the areas with the mid-block areas with street trees are much safer for pedestrians and drivers. So they're not FHOs, they're not fixed hazardous objects. And of course, you line them up, and you almost get a wall between the street and the sidewalk, which is wonderful. This is an artist rendering that would never happen in reality. That fellow would not be that close to the edge of the street. And this was something, this was showing off. This was showing off a new street that we built, probably in Florida. Not we. But this doesn't happen. No one's going to walk on a sidewalk like that without protection, trees, or cars. You've got a push button. Your main intersection here, you have a push button. Jason and I waited a long time. You should have concurrent signalization. What that means is that pedestrians get the light when the cars get the light. You shouldn't have to wait around. You shouldn't have to push a button. You shouldn't have to ask for a light when you're a pedestrian. But there's a new thing called the LPI. I'm sure some of you know about the lead pedestrian interval. It means actually the crosswalk sign goes 3 or 4 seconds before the cars get the light so that they can claim the intersection. But concurrent signalization with LPIs is the way to go, not having to push a button to cross. All right, the last two categories are much shorter. So I'm only half done with my list, but I'm plowing through my talk. The comfortable walk is it's the most sophisticated and counterintuitive aspect of this conversation because we all love wide open spaces and climbing mountains and getting great views, but actually the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, humans among them, were simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. Prospect means that you can see your predators before they attack you, and refuge means that your flanks feel covered from attack. And if your flanks don't feel covered, you don't feel safe. And so our favorite spaces have prospect and refuge. But refuge, I think, is more important. A plaza is only as good as its edges. A street is only as good as its street walls. If you don't have space, you don't have place. Placemaking is all about space making. You can't make spaces without good edges. Bill knows these diagrams from 25 years ago. We new urbanists have been talking for a long time. What's the ideal ratio of height to width? 1:1 is the Renaissance ideal. Trees really help. Beyond 6:1, without trees, you probably don't feel enclosed anymore, and you're no longer comfortable within a space. And that's enough to make you choose to not be a pedestrian. So, 6:1 vertically in Salzburg, pretty awesome, right? And this is north of Boston. But 6:1 is fantastic. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. This is Houston a long time ago. This part of Houston is doing a lot better now, but I always show this slide to remind us that it's the surface parking lot. Typically, that's the normal villain in this goal of having better spatial definition. It just isn't the same. This is, look at this. This is Madrid. I haven't been. I got to get here. Because talk about outdoor living room. There are holes and there are porticos and ways to get through, right? But people understood this is how you create a place that attracts people. But this is also like modernist architects in Europe. And I have nothing against modern architecture, but I have something against modernist planning. They don't understand the need for spatial definition. They allow the spaces to bleed. And this is where I either keep you or I lose you, because this is the trickiest part of this conversation. I know that you'll enjoy all these slides, though, which is that, we pay a lot of money to get on airplanes to visit these places. You just can't see out of them. You can't even see out. The typical American square, particularly in Texas, the courtyard square, you can still see out on every corner, right? But the places this is Boston, sorry. This is my neighborhood. Well, I don't live in this neighborhood. I can't afford it. But this is Beacon Hill. This is Burlington, Vermont. This is a DPZ project in North Carolina. This is one of my projects, Rosemary Beach in Florida. Somewhere in Germany. We were in Bari, and everyone's having dinner. Like the plaza is everyone's dining room. You can't see out of these places. This is Rosemary Beach again. This spatial definition is what makes the places we really want to be in. This is a funny story. This is Lake Forest, Illinois, and this is Munster, Indiana, where they proposed the exact same shape as Lake Forest, Illinois. And this was their promotion of it. You can see, here we are in Munster. This is Lake Forest, but in Munster, we're going to build this, modeling a Lake Forest. But they forgot the edges. They forgot the buildings. So, you can see the Lake Forest on the right, Munster on the left. This is Lake Forest. I went. This is Munster. It doesn't matter what pattern you put on the ground if you don't shape it into an outdoor living room. And there's I don't know if you guys are shadow study crazy here, but we need more shadows now with climate change. We don't need fewer shadows. We need more shadows. The New Yorker has this thing where you can make your own, and you can make your own captions to their, it's a contest every week. I've never won, but I'm always trying. People particularly in Texas, are looking for the shadows to occupy. So that's part of it. But the spatial definition is the most important thing. Now, the reserve has this code that is great. It says the buildings have to be at least 27 feet tall, and there's no maximum height limit. And the point I want to make here, while city councilors and others are listening, and I work for a lot of developers as well, they're doing the math every day. How many stories do I get? Okay, then how many pools, fountains, playgrounds, school contributions, right? The amenities in the neighborhood, the thing that make it a place where people want to be, are strictly a function of how many units that they can put on a given piece of property. And to have an arbitrary 3-story or 4-story height limit anywhere, when there's already a natural cutoff around 5 or 6 stories because of construction methods, would be crazy. And I know that here, what's proposed for over there is, I think, 5 stories, which is the appropriate height. But there's no reason, if you suppress your height anywhere, particularly in these new developments, which don't have people across the street, like literally next door to them in little tiny houses, if you suppress height, you're suppressing neighborhood amenity. So this building that you pass on your way into town on Main Street, it's great. It's a nice building. It could easily have been, I'm not saying economically it could have been, but it would have been more productive as a 5-story building. I wanted to make one other comment about this plan, which is a nice street grid. But just something to keep in mind is that most streets are symmetrical. You know, most great streets you want to be on have houses across from houses, apartments across from apartments. Streets have character, which tends to be consistent, offices across from offices, and that's generally how you zone a plan. The one mistake I see in this plan is that it's zoned, not zoned in terms of use, but not zoned in terms of zoning, but zoned in terms of actually how the different uses are provided. All of the lines are in the middle of the street. So you walk down a typical street and you have mixed-use retail across from medium-density residential, or office retail across the street from mixed-use retail. When we do plans, we draw the use lines in the middle of the block, not in the middle of the street. And that helps create consistent spaces. Getting really sophisticated here. So now let's look at the village at South Point, which is by a firm I work with and enjoy. And you can see that they're doing the right thing in most of the plan, which is creating these perimeter blocks. The parking is hid. The first people to do this probably in the modern era was Southlake. If you know David Shores' Southlake outside of Dallas. But the idea that you've got big parking lots, but they're hidden in the middle of big blocks, and if you're not dense enough to structure the parking, this is the right solution. You've got to have big blocks. You hide the parking in the middle, and you surround it by buildings. That's great. That's happening everywhere in the plan. But something weird is happening here, and something weird is happening here. The first thing is like the town square. It's just a very rural conception of, you know, and they drew this drawing. It might be appropriate for a camp, but it's not the kind of urban heart. It doesn't have a shape to it. It's not an outdoor living room, right? It's a kind of leftover residual space that's sweet, but in my experience, these kind of spaces don't attract the kind of crowds and activity that you get when you make truly an outdoor living room. And then they kind of gave up down by the street. So I don't know what the mandate was. I don't know what the limitations were. I know the designers, they're good. They're operating in a environment. But this is really bad because the buildings are floating in parking. There's no space making. There's parking lot in front. There's parking lot in back. There's no there. Where would you walk and have a good walk? So I would say this part of the plan certainly needs reconsidering. Then there's Starland Ranch, which also, again, Looney Rick's Kiss, great firm. It's going to have great architecture. I have some questions about the plan, but my biggest concern is at the entry where you have what is the heart of the community and you have shopping, and I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but the only place here that has any real spatial definition is this tiny spot between the row houses and the shops. And everything else just completely bleeds. It just bleeds. So what I tried to draw here was your feeling of space when you're in that town square. This is the heart of the community. It doesn't have the edges to make it lively. Are you still with me? It needs edges to be a place, it needs to be a space. To be a space, it needs edges, and that's what's missing. And this one is real. This is something we very much need to fix. This is South Point Phase 9, and it's got a lot of great things going on, but there's a lack of continuity of the outdoor living rooms. This is a great outdoor living room, this big central park. This is a wonderful outdoor living room, this main street lined on both ways. Here's a little outdoor living room. By the way, up against the highway, which I would make more of an effort to hide, right? Up against the highway. Here's a wonderful outdoor living room, but you have to go through a parking lot to get to it. People won't do that. People. Is this now or is this a plan? This is a plan. These are plans that are preliminary. Okay. So you have to walk through a park. We see this happen a lot. This is a great urban space. This is a great urban space, but they're not connected in a way that's going to cause people to walk to them. And then you have all these buildings that if they're on a street, I mean, they kind of are. If they're on a street, it's a one-sided street facing a parking lot. But you've got a front facing a back across a parking lot, which isn't space making. And it's easy to fix. So what I did was I hid the highway, and I'd like to have a sound wall too. I hid the highway, I put the parking behind the buildings, right? I pulled the buildings down two rows of parking instead of 3. And I created a 2-sided street And I only did half because I ran out of time. One of these blocks like you saw in that earlier plan I showed you, the big donut with surface parking in it, all of the streets now are two-sided, they're shaped, and they connect to each other. It's about the same amount of building, it's about the same amount of parking, but that's how you make, here, you inhabit this area, and you go down this street, like to what? Or you go down this street, beautiful street along the lake, to what? They're not connected, they're both, in terms of the pedestrian realm, they both end. Whereas here you have a connected, complete network where you never have to leave that good feeling, well-enclosed space. Hope I don't get attacked. And then, of course, trees are so important, not just for safety, but for comfort. I think your standards are changing. The more recent subdivisions I was in had street trees. If you don't already, and you want to create a community that has value and retains value, you will have a street tree every 30 feet on center minimum on all new streets built in your town. Period. That's the way. Douglas Dwani, who is Andres Dwani's brother, once had me, he said, I want you to drive around this neighborhood. It was Little Havana in Miami. I want you to drive around Little Havana, think about the different neighborhood parts of it, and then look at the trees. And I realized after that drive, all the places that felt good and rich, relatively middle-class rich, had trees, and all the places that felt dangerous and poor didn't have trees. And they're that important. They're so important. And then there's like the epitome of trees in Greenville. Who's been to Greenville, South Carolina? I know some of you have. This is the amazing Main Street in Greenville, which I think is a model for you guys. What's funny is Greenville has this tremendous reputation, Greenville. And actually, it's like the only green street in Greenville. Now, it is 1.5 miles long, and it's a tremendous walk. It's a half an hour of heaven. But it's got angle parking. It's got interruptions, periodic interruptions to the angle parking, where there's not only the trees in the sidewalk, but then trees come and reach out into the street. So it looks like this when you're on it. And it's just spectacular. And you could have that here. This is Rosemary Beach, which I showed you already. We planted these trees. And I'm old, but I'm not that old. This is 15 years ago. We planted these trees on a state highway. And these are live oaks, which grow really slow. And it's heaven. So, I know that maybe 15 years is too long for you guys, but if you make an effort now, you can have this here in 15 years. That's the comfortable walk. The quickest is the interesting walk. Talked about spatial ratios, 1-to-1 being the Renaissance ideal. This is 1-to-1. This is Grand Rapids, which is a very walkable downtown. I've done a lot of work there. But no one wants to walk down this street where one side of the street is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a conference facility, apparently designed in admiration for the parking deck. But it's just boring, right? Exposed parking is boring. Horizontal lines are boring. And a lack of variety is boring. We learned from Mayor Riley in Charleston, it only takes 30 feet of housing to hide 300 feet of garage, that thin edge. If you're building any garages in your town, you need to make sure they're lined against anywhere where you want people to walk. You have to make sure they're lined. This one I call the Chia Pet Garage. It's in South Beach in Miami. You get the idea. The older storefronts have been preserved against the street. And then there's the lack of variety. We can blame the architects. Whenever a famous architect gets a big project, they like to treat it like a giant architectural project and repeat the same building over and over again. This is Zaha Hadid. This is Steve Hole. This is in Bratislava, I think. This is in China. But this is what you do if you care about place, which is you actually impose artificial variety, because we make buildings now that are too big. And this is what we call, the technical term is the demise line. You take a large building and you pretend it's multiple buildings. This is one building. This is in Somerville, Mass. by Ilkis Manfredi. And they were mandated in the plan to make it look like 3 buildings. So there's actually a reason to walk, an interesting reason to walk. Jane Jacobs said, no one willingly walks from repetition to repetition or sameness to sameness, even if the effort expended is minimal. So we want variety when we walk. This is City Place in Palm Beach, one building. So South Point Phase 9 again, which I'm picking on, but this looks pretty nice, right? It's with the exception of the issue I raised, it's a skillful plan. This looks great. There's variety there. This looks fine, but this doesn't look fine. Like, why repeat? Why repeat the same building? I tell you why, because it's cheaper to repeat the same building, but it's boring to repeat the same building. So I would advocate. It doesn't exist yet, no. Okay. But there's plenty of places in town that do look like this, because developers, and I don't know if I've ever known a community, an administration, municipality that made demise lines a rule. I don't know about that. In Australia, they do it. But I do know a lot of developers who make demise lines a rule because they want their property to be as valuable as possible. They want to get as rich as possible. So they say, let's make an interesting place, and they don't let two buildings be the same. And that's the goal. So I'm not done yet, but guess what? I've gone through the whole list. You made it, all 4 reasons. You really need to do all 4 of these things at once. You can't just do 3 of them or 2 of them. But that's okay, because most places that have reputations for being walkable, like Greenville, are actually mostly drivable, but for those people who want that lifestyle, either to live in an apartment or a house nearby, or who want to come visit it, much more likely you want to come, what we call a park once environment, come and park and enjoy it. You know, the city builds its reputation on those few walkable places that are in it. When people picture this town, they don't picture some cul-de-sac. They picture, you know, when you go into Google Maps, the arrow lands right here on this main street, and this is your reputation. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to get a little more into detail on Starland Ranch, a little more on Harvest Point, and then I want to focus on downtown. Starland Ranch, I just want to bring up because it baffles me a little bit for 2 reasons. Independent of the spatial definition issue, there's 2 entrances. There's the entrance here to the neighborhood market, and it's independent of a standard suburban cul-de-sac community drive-in. This way, everyone who comes in can not shop and not meet their neighbor. That's the first thing that kind of confuses me. To make the retail work, you want every possible driver going by. You want to be able to pick up your mail at the town center. This heart of the community is kind of cast to the side of the community. These 2 entrances, I believe, should be the same. Then there's a different structural issue, which is you take this main street in, and it kind of stops, and then you come across, and you start again. There's no real structure to the plan. And now I'm getting into something that I didn't even talk about, but that people want legible places where they kind of know what they're aiming at and that there's a logic to the way it's organized. And I really think that if there's a main street, it should be a main street, not just stop and then make you start over again. So, you know, here's the entry. It's just it's got a sign. We're going to have a beautiful sign. Your town's full of beautiful signs. Like, this isn't going to make this any different from anything else. So I actually, last night, took the liberty of redesigning it. And what I'm showing here, I'll go forward, is based on Rosemary Beach, the town I showed you, where the highway, it's the 2-lane highway, but the highway is right here. And then we split the entry into a loop. There's retail all around it. That's under construction, done now. There's retail all around it. There's parking around the green. And then the main streets head out from that loop. But it's a heart. It feels like a real heart of the community. And it looks like this when you get there. That's what you see when you look in. So what I'm proposing is one entry that's a loop, that's a square, with parking around it. And then this can be retail, this can be retail. You don't need much more retail, but of course, then these are the apartments. These are the densest buildings towards the center of the community. Then you peel off and you get a view into the lake, and then this street becomes the main street and stays the main street. So you have one street that's your main street. I put another street back here, ending with two docks. You know, who knows if that's the right solution. And then I stopped because I ran out of time. But the point is that I really think you should consolidate the activity at one major entrance, which is the heart of the community, and then have a structure that's continuous as opposed to broken up. That's my suggestion there. Again, I get to leave. And then Harvest Point, there's 3 separate pieces due to easements and other things. There's a very dense area with 3,000 units. There's a more single-family area with cottage courts and single-family houses, but nothing else. And then there's the town-owned land to the north, which is going to be the real downtown. Now, I've shown you a bunch of projects that are on the boards. In all honesty, some of them will happen, some of them won't happen. This is the one that is likely to happen and is to be so significant and right up against the highway, right? So it's well served by car infrastructure. This is the one that will really put you guys on the map and will offer that more urban quality of life to people who want to have that quality of life here in Mansfield. It's pretty amazing. Certainly, we've accomplished similar things. I'm not working on this, but we've accomplished similar things. We New Urbanists have accomplished similar things in other places, also in Texas. And it's generally quite well done. I do feel like, have you guys heard the term missing middle housing? There's a whole bunch of stuff between the apartment house and the single family that I'd love to see you let into this neighborhood. I don't see why it has to be just apartments with structured parking, and 3,000 units, amazing. Here, and then, power line, play fields, and just single-family houses and cottage courts. So I do suggest that. I'm most concerned about the area to the north, though. A couple things I want to call to your attention in the latest plan, which is this one, zooming in. The first is that the road that separates them, is this Lone Star Road, is that right? Lone Star has kind of been reconceived as a more arterial road with parking lots along it that are serving a little kind of Central Park. But Central Park should not have parking lots in it, right? There's the opportunity to have enough parking along the street, even if it's angle parking, that we shouldn't have parking lots on the edge of our park, turning that into another suburban, collector road. Secondly, and I'm not saying this is doing this badly, but secondly, this is an amazing opportunity to be your main street that's connecting the 3,000 units to the south, so maybe 5,000 people, and all. I mean, this is the heart of the whole community, and I worry about the spatial definition and the sequence and the activity of this street. It's the perfect length for retail. The whole thing should be retail, and if I'm reading the colors right, this is retail, but they're a little one-story retail strip with the real big buildings are pushed back. So you're not getting that height against the edge of the street. This would be very low. Meanwhile, and retail wants to be two-sided, across the street you have office buildings, which I don't believe are slated to have retail in the ground floor. And then you come up, it steps back, there's a little plaza. It looks like a parking lot, but it's not. It's a green, it's a plaza, that bleeds into a parking lot. It's got all this exposure into parking because this building hasn't turned the corner. And then you arrive at the stadium, which is, I think, a good arrival. And you have, this is like a arts and convention kind of facility. Yeah. So it's a good use, but I hope that it's tall enough. This will be nice and tall. This will be too low. This will be potentially tall, but not activated at the ground floor. And so if I can offer one critique for this plan before I run out of town, it's to really focus on the space making along this axis and understand that you need to surround it, you need to shape it, you need to retail it up, and that this is going to be you're going to have two main streets. And we experienced this in West Palm Beach. We created a new place in West Palm Beach called City Place, and it's doing great. And Clematis Street, the old heart of West Palm Beach, is doing great. The city has both. It has the new downtown and the old downtown, and one doesn't hurt the other because it actually attracts people to your community. So you shape this up, great, and you shape that up, you make this right, but don't let it be anything less than serious height and serious retail on that axis.
Stuff, right?
This is all early planning. I don't.
Where I live. It's not about my neighborhood.
Yeah,
I'm like anything like this.
Yeah, I don't. I get to not focus on those issues. So now let's. And I will not be taking questions. Actually, I will be taking questions, but I won't be able to answer questions like that. So let's finish with downtown. Tremendous potential, tremendous assets, historic architecture, a lot of active and inactive fronts. Of course, venues that bring people downtown, decent streetscaping in some places, amazing new sweet spots, and as I learned last night, an absolute world-class, or at least regional class steakhouse right here. I couldn't tell. I went in. I'm like, wow, this could be in Vegas or South Beach. You've got rear-end angle parking, or is it front-end angle parking? And I'm not going to talk about that because it's not so important. Both are pretty safe. And then when you make the street right, if people choose to park the wrong way, it won't really even matter because no one's going to be going all that fast. You've got this main intersection, the heart of your city, not the highest and best use. And we'll talk more about that, but you can see as you approach fairly broad street that the corner lacks that spatial definition, lacks that space making, and you didn't hear it from me, but we could rename this tire company. I just made that up. No one's told me that's going to happen. But mostly you've got this 5-lane road that, as I suggested, could be a 3-lane road. And how could that be accomplished with 3 lanes, which we know is all it needs? It's 7. Now, I'm going to show you one solution, but there's 5 good solutions. There's 10 solutions, 5 of which are good. 77 feet from curb to curb and 100-foot right-of-way. Here's what you've got now. 5 lanes of driving and 2 lanes of parking. What I'm recommending as one solution is angle parking around 3 lanes, which would give you a ton more parking supply that allows you to float a ton more housing, but importantly, interrupting that parking every now and then, like in Greenville, with an island. Now, the other thing I forgot to mention is when you do this, you gain 11 feet, so you can plant trees in the sidewalk as well. So you're expanding the sidewalk with trees everywhere, 30 feet on center max, and then every 5 parking spaces or so, you're putting in an island with more trees. There's almost no cheaper way to add value. That's what I'm recommending for Main Street, like Greenville. North of, it's one of many possible solutions. Then south, from the south, approaching Broad Street, it's remarkably 6 lanes. 2 lanes north, right lane, turn, left lane, turn, 2 lanes through. It only needs to be 3 lanes. That gives you the opportunity for, I continued the back-end parking, but it's not important to me whether it's front-end or back-end. And again, adding trees where there's extra room because the road doesn't need to be that wide, and you can add other trees in between the parking spaces. So that's South Main Street South. Here's Broad. Whenever you have a median that doesn't have trees in it, it's basically a highway detail. People look at that and they say, oh, I'm on a highway. So that median can come out. You've got 65 feet in an 85-foot right-of-way. That gives you room to actually do, again, 3 lanes and double-angle parking. So what I'm trying to do is add a ton of parking to your downtown in a way that will slow traffic, get trees between it, but also float. Create 100 or 200 parking spaces that will then float residential. And any developer who comes in to build can actually have those spaces for free and attach them to the units and show that to the bank and get a loan without building parking. So again, Broad Street proposed, Broad Street between spots, and that's both the east side and west side. And just for a small distance, the entire intervention I'm talking about is basically from here to here and from the top to the bottom of this slide. It's expensive, but it's small, so it won't be that expensive because you're not doing that much of it. This is one place where I think a rebuild, which I don't normally recommend, a rebuild of a limited area will pay off in spades. So that's my recommendation. I'm going to end with this project by my friends Moulin Polyzoides as inspiration. This is Lancaster, California. This is kind of what you're starting with, right? And here's what they did, which I'm not sure if they were willing to go to 2 lanes. They were willing to go to 2 lanes, not 3, and they cut the traffic on this street down. I'm not saying you need to do that. You might want to do that. And this cost $11 million. And it generated, well, first of all, crashes, injury crashes dropped by half, pedestrian crashes dropped by 78%, pedestrian activity doubled, 57 new businesses opened, 800 new housing units came, 2,000 new jobs with a $282 million economic impact. So that was $11 million well spent. And I'm suggesting that there are places where that sort of investment makes sense, and I think you're one of them. So we can go from suburban to urban in Mansfield. And that's my talk. Thank you. But I do want to end with a few resources. The books, again, if you're trying to convince yourself or someone else of why walkability matters and how to do it, this is the book. It's got a new 10th anniversary edition. I just wrote 100 new pages that talk about what's happened in the last 10 years. So if you own it already, you want to give yours away and get a new one. If you're a technician or doing this work, this is the book that you should use as well. Much more detailed with a lot of diagrams, charts, data. The 2 TED Talks, this one I mentioned is about why walkability is important, and there's another one that looks like this that's about how, that's a 15-minute version of what I've given you tonight, obviously not catered to Mansfield, but if you have friends who you want to give a snippet to, you could show them that. I teach a course at Harvard, just 2 days, open to everyone. It happens to be next week, and 5 people from Mansfield are coming. You guys win. One of you came a few years ago, and that led to me being here and to others of you coming. But it's not closed yet. If anyone else wants to join your compatriots next week, let me know. Just tell me. And everything I've talked about, and books and links and everything else are all at my website, which is myname.com with a K at the end. So that is it. You clapped already, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to take questions, but not from this guy because I'm a little worried.
I'll take his questions.
Jeff, let
Yeah.
me ask you about demographic changes, right? We have a population that's getting older. We're seeing here in Mansfield, at least our neighborhood, where, you know, we're empty nesters, et cetera, in terms of options, right? Where we don't want to leave our neighborhood, but
Yeah.
again, access to a store, hospital, et cetera, that's walkable. Thoughts about how we sort of think about demographic changes and what we can build on.
Well, particularly aging. Have you guys heard of the NORC? The sociologists came up with the term the NORC in the 1980s. It stands for Naturally Occurring Retirement Community. And the first one they identified was the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It's basically a place that no one ever planned, but that older people with money all move to because they can have a higher quality of life in those places. It's very clear. You know who's been a great friend to new urbanism and walkable communities has been AARP. And they have the whole Livable Communities Initiative, and they're always advocating for their membership. You know, rather than living in an environment where the minute you lose your driver's license, you're warehoused in an institution, you know, where you're lucky if there's a van that takes you to the mall on Tuesdays, right? And people fight to the death to not give up their keys because they know that when they give them up, they're done, right? If you can manage to live in a place, even a little downtown like this, where you can walk to many of your daily needs, particularly now that so many things can be delivered, the demands aren't that high. But the idea that you can have a social lifestyle in your community, that makes walking much more in demand. If I can say, there's 15 years of your life when your kids are there's 15 years of your life when your kids are in public school. And those are the 15 years where schools are going to drive all your decision making. I mean, I did it, everyone did it. We moved to the place where our kids could have the best schools. That's a small portion of your life. And all the years before that and all the years after that, you want to live in the kind of place that makes your life exciting. When we were moving back to Boston from DC, my wife had this test. She would create a ratio of bars to sewing shops. And if it was less than 1, we would not move to that community. And my wife's a lot of fun. And you know, many people want that. They really want that. And there's only a small segment of your long life that there's another goal that causes you, right, to be in the suburban cul-de-sac. But then there's choices before and after that are different. Yes, Axel.
Bob,
No, Drex.
You're rhyming it, Hexel.
Hexel.
Yeah.
This is the third time I've met Hexel.
Bond programs. So Dallas is actually in its solicitation phase, and I don't want to make this about Dallas because we're Mansfield, but every city goes through that, process. But we're in the space now where, if whoever lives in the city, you can go online and you can submit either a needs request or an improvement request. So we have this opportunity to submit ideas and requests for things we want on our street in our neighborhood. So what advice would you give to people, and hopefully you can give some advice that I can easily replicate and tell other people to do, in this opportunity to go and make needs requests and improvement requests, what do you suggest for people going through that process?
Well, it's not something I'm that familiar with, so I have no specific advice for you, except that what I've seen is a lot of good happen around crosswalks, along bike lanes, around tree planting, around tree replacement, right, when trees die, through that process, so I support it. I would mention another aspect of citizen involvement, which is it's very interesting to see how public meetings have changed over 30 years. And I've been appearing at public meetings for 30 years, sometimes representing developers, sometimes representing cities. And it used to be that two groups would show up. The friends of the developer, FODs, who are either going to make money from the project happening, or just were friends of the developer and wanted to support them in their work. And then the NIMBYs, who might be actually right that a coming development will lower their quality of life because they're exactly next to it. And it's very possible when you're right next to something that a new development will lower your quality of life. It's beholden upon a responsible government, planning commission or zoning board, to look to what's best for the whole city and not just for the people who are right next to it. But in any case, those are the two groups that would show up. About 10 years ago, and now in major force, there's a third group that shows up that's as big as the other two groups, and that's people who care about housing, and people who care about safety, and people who care about the environment and quality of life. You can call them YIMBYs, you can call them what you want. I was working in Newton, Massachusetts. Does anyone know Newton? It's the 6th largest city in Massachusetts. It's outside of Boston. It's wealthy. It's not diverse. But it's progressive. It doesn't always walk its talk. But this is what's happening at the community meetings in Newton, is this third group would show up, often wearing bike helmets. I'm like, don't give it away. Like, don't wear the bike helmet. Advocating for attainable housing and advocating for a more sustainable lifestyle, advocating for kids to be able to live near their parents or for elders to retire in place. And they tend to win the day because they're disinterested in all the right ways. Right? They have no skin in the game. And so their word is listened to. And I don't know what degree that might be happening. I know it happens in Dallas. I don't know what happened down here so much. But that's been a very positive thing to see. And that's why I say to folks like you, you don't have to limit yourself to as you haven't, you don't have to limit yourself to the community you live in. You can show up at different communities and let your voice be heard in support of these higher objectives. I want to make a point that it probably will be raised, but it hasn't been raised, and I forgot to raise it during my talk, which is obviously that you're a suburban community, you're a lower density community, and all these projects I showed that shocked some of you are quite different from what you're currently living. And I'm sure your first reaction is, oh, we can't handle the cars, we got enough traffic, we have enough happening here. The way to solve traffic is to have mixed use. It's to capture trips within communities. It's to have places where people want to stay and live and work and play, and to have that real, completeness. You're never going to satisfy your congestion here because any new lane you provide will be filled. The only real constraint to driving here is congestion. So if you get rid of it, you get more driving. I didn't really dwell on that. But point being, will these new developments solve your traffic problem? No. Will they worsen your traffic problem? Probably not much because they're up against the highway, right? But are they the beginning of a solution to your traffic problem? Yes, because they capture more things internally. People will have to drive to work. They will have to drive to the hospital or to university, maybe. The typical suburban house generates 13 car trips per day. Those are one-way trips, which means someone's not making it home at night. That's the average, 13 average. But why? Like 3/4 of those trips are for soccer or for daycare or for cat food. Oh, and I forgot to say it. I know this isn't the city's choice, but it's called Harvest Point. Harvest Point needs a school, absolutely needs a school. And you got to fight with your school board to get a K through 8 or whatever you have in that community, because you're going to have thousands of children that should be able to walk to school. I forgot to mention that. That's really important. Somewhere in there. But making complete communities. Every little bit helps. Having a corner store captures, maybe the third of the trips out of a neighborhood. But as a city, if you're serious about this, you need to move forward with the goal of creating truly complete neighborhoods. Yes.
Okay, two things. One,
You only get one thing.
from a design architecture perspective, buildings, I'm sure Mansfield does this much better than the community I live in, but functionally, we have requirements of articulation, doors, etc. What we end up getting is the bump out that doesn't go floor to roof, and doors that are styled to look like windows that have a stoop in front of the board with no sidewalk between that and the sidewalk. And
Yeah.
Really, like the only entrance to the stuff is in the back by the parking lot. So the first question is, are there any best practices or people we can look at or in towns to understand what good code requirements can alleviate those problems? And then the second goes to what you were drawing out with sort of a continuous street, and what you were talking about these areas is just how do you integrate these projects when they come to your town with the ability for additional investment by other private actors to expand it and be a cohesive area as opposed to walled off with a big stroke?
Yeah, so one thing communities can insist on is minimum connectivity. So if you have an area with a perimeter, you need to have a road, and we've done this when I was at DPZ, we did this on every project, whether we were doing it ourselves or legislating it for someone else, is every X number of feet, maybe every 600 feet, if you're adjacent to something which you could potentially connect to, you need a space for a street. It might eventually become a house lot if the people next to you won't connect, but as the person building that development, you need to actually allow for that to happen. And in fact, that's the only way that you're going to get people off of the arterials and the collector roads, is if you insist as a community that new developments have a minimum amount of connectivity to their perimeter. To your first question, cities can exert more or less control over the design of properties, particularly ones that they own. So in the case of that northern part of Harvest Point, or buildings that happen downtown on city land, the city can be very specific if it wants. And for example, that boulevard I showed you in Carmel, Indiana, that had the 18-foot brick streets, that was a case where the city had me do a plan, and then I created what's called a regulating plan. And the regulating plan shows where the edges of the building have to go. It shows where the demise lines have to go. It shows where real stoops have to sit. It shows how the parking can't be exposed to the street. And then you do that through a public process, then you go out to developers after that. Say, oh, who wants to develop according to this regulating plan, which doesn't control everything, but it controls what matters. So that's something that I don't know the city's process or where it is with that particular project, but cities can, on land they own, they can be extremely rigorous. On land they don't own, it's harder, but you can have a rule. I've seen cities that have a rule. No more than 400 feet, or even less, no more than 200 feet of a building can have a continuous facade that looks like one building. If your building is more than 200 feet, then you need to have it look like multiple buildings. That's legislatable, right? So, the development community can, you do a dance with the development community over that. Yes?
So you got to spend a couple days in Mansfield. development, I think overall we've got a general like mixed use concept. We maybe need to work on street networks and space making, but that's those. And then you talked about downtown, but you drove around town, you've seen we're a pretty suburban, low density community. And so if you're trying to allocate resources and try to figure out where I know you've talked in your book about triage, and obviously downtown would be the space with the roads. But at the same time, we have other projects throughout the city in suburbia.
Yeah.
So do we continue on that suburban model in those other areas? Do you just place those things on hold? Do you slowly transition them over time? How does that look?
My triage concept is about specifically investments in walkability. It doesn't say, let the rest of your city burn down. But it says if you're gonna put beautiful light fixtures and sidewalks and benches on a street, make sure it's a street that people are gonna walk on. Because I've certainly seen the opposite. Where in Charlestown, Georgia, where they'd invested in beautiful streetscaping along a street that no one would ever walk on, right? So don't let your suburban areas fall apart and make whatever investments you need to, but don't invest in walkability in places where that's an unrealistic expectation. You should certainly be investing in safety in those areas, and that's just straight reading maps. Where are people getting hurt and dying? And that's where you should be investing in safer intersections, safer crosswalks, safety for drivers as well as for pedestrians. But I do feel like there are only a few places where investments in walkability are going to make sense, and I've talked about those. This is the first talk I've given in ever where I didn't mention bicycles, I don't think, at all, except for at the very beginning. Normally I have a big segment on bikes. I haven't seen one cyclist here, and I'm a big bike fan, but you're part of a region, this piece of Dallas where it doesn't make sense to bike. And I wish it were different. But if you make a nice biking lane down Main Street, people are going to get to the end of it and die. I mean, I'm surprised no one gave me a hard time, but I don't think you're anytime soon going to be a biking city. And so that's an example of being practical in your investments.
It's more like, so if you've got a 4-lane divided thoroughfare, 12-foot lanes, and there's congestion on it, or it's time to go through reconstruction, do you widen that to 6-lane, 12-foot wide lanes, or do you keep with the more knowing that over time things evolve?
Well, I would never recommend that and let me interrupt my answer to say, yes, you have a wonderful bike trail, and you should invest in bike trails and try to make bike trail biking useful, but I don't think these streets are ready for it. What did you just ask me?
Like a divided thoroughfare.
Oh, so I want you to understand that you will not solve, you know this. You won't solve congestion by adding lanes. So there may be places where it makes sense to add lanes, but the reason can't be congestion. And I didn't show that segment because it didn't seem like it was relevant to the changes that are currently happening. But there's this thing that you probably heard of called the law of induced demand. And the data all point 100% clearly to the fact that any new capacity you put in your roadways will be typically 40% absorbed by new car trips immediately and 100% absorbed by new car trips within 4 years. And that's because, development's happening and other things are being made to happen as a result of that additional capacity, and because the principal constraint to driving in your community is congestion. It isn't that people won't drive, it's that they might drive a little bit off peak. And if you have more lanes, they'll drive more on peak. If you have fewer lanes, they'll drive more off peak. But it's an equilibrium. The traffic you hate is exactly the amount you're willing to put up with, and that's a stasis. So I wouldn't build more streets unless you want more driving. And I think that's an issue in Harvest Point, where you can, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the city engineers look at Harvest Point and say, oh, everyone's going to be driving 13 car trips per day, we need these to be 4-lane roads and 2-lane roundabouts instead of a more detailed, delicate plan, then guess what? People will take 13 car trips per day because it's going to be a bleak, unwalkable environment. So you have to create the city you want. And understand that what happened in the 20th century is that cars behave like water, and they filled the space that they were given, and the cities that gave them more space got more cars, and the cities that gave them less space got fewer cars. And when you're building a new piece of your city, that's the choice you're making. And that's why I hate traffic studies, because they're a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you do the math, and the traffic study tells you, I'm looking for people with M on their shirt. If you do the math and the traffic study tells you, based on suburban trip generation rates, that you need these wide lanes, well, guess what? You put them in, you're going to generate those trips. And the new places should not be driven by traffic counts. Because if you plan for people and places, you get people and places. If you plan for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. It's that simple. I should stop. That was a good way to end. And I'm quoting all the best people. Yeah, thank you.